In 1901, inside the cold stillness of the Frogmore Mausoleum, Queen Victoria was waiting. But not for her final rest. She was waiting to give one last command. The new King Edward VII and the entire royal family were ordered from the room, leaving only her personal doctor and trusted dresser behind. They had a list 12 pages of secret, explicit instructions. This wasn't just a state funeral. This was a meticulously staged, almost pagan ritual enacted in absolute silence. Victoria. The name is an entire epoch, the widow of an empire. The very symbol of propriety, the woman who defined public morality for a generation. So how did the icon of public decorum demand a burial filled with such strange, secret, and deeply controversial items? Some were for her beloved husband, Prince Albert. That was expected. But others were for a man the kingdom had tried its best to forget. She was taking her most scandalous secret to the grave, placing it in a position of honor equal to her husband's memory. It turns out the curse wasn't a phantom haunting her for 40 years. The curse was control and absolute unyielding obsession with rewriting her own legacy from inside a mahogany box. And that cursed chamber, the one sealed with the secrets of an empire and a woman's heart, was her own coffin. It began, as all such things do, with a perfectly reasonable tragedy. When Prince Albert died in 1861, a switch was flipped within the British Empire, and the world was plunged into darkness. Not just any darkness, but a specific, curated, and impeccably styled shade of black. Queen Victoria, his widow, led the charge. This was her duty, and no monarch in history had ever understood duty quite like her. The nation was expected to mourn, and so it did. Shops sold out of black crepe. Etiquette manuals were hastily updated with new chapters on the precise duration and depth of acceptable sorrow for every conceivable relation. Public funds were diverted to memorials, grand Gothic structures that clawed at the sky, testaments in stone and marble to a love that death could not conquer. This was all as it should be. A beloved prince consort was gone. His wife, the queen, was heartbroken. The initial phase was a masterclass in public grieving, a performance of dignified sorrow that united a global empire. Victoria's pain was her people's pain. Her loss was a national wound. The language used in Parliament, in newspapers, and in sermons was one of solemn respect, of shared loss, of a commitment to honor the memory of a great man. From the outside, the system was functioning perfectly. The monarchy was reaffirming its connection to its subjects through a universal human experience. It was sad, it was proper, and it was, for a time, completely normal. But then the seasons changed, and the Queen did not. The black crepe was never put away. The shutters were never reopened. Victoria retreated from public life, immuring herself in the cold palaces and castles that had once been filled with laughter and intellectual debate. She became a ghost in her own life, the spectral widow of Windsor. The initial understandable grief began to calcify, hardening from a fluid emotion into a rigid, unchangeable state of being. The memorials to Albert kept rising, no longer just gestures of remembrance, but monuments to a sorrow that refused to fade. It was one thing to mourn a husband. It was another entirely to turn mourning into the central policy of the realm. The world outside saw a monarch consumed by a legendary devotion. It was romantic in a grim sort of way, a story of undying love. But behind the castle walls, something far stranger was taking hold. Grief was no longer a feeling. It had become a set of unbreakable rules, a liturgy of remembrance that bordered on obsession. Albert's rooms in every royal residence were to be preserved exactly as he had left them. Not a book could be moved, not a paper disturbed. Each evening his clothes were laid out for dinner. Each morning a servant brought hot water for his shave and a fresh towel. For decades the staff performed these intimate services for a dead man participants in a silent daily ritual that denied the reality of his absence. This was not remembrance. This was an active, ongoing attempt to hold time itself hostage. The Queen was not merely honoring her husband's memory, she was refusing to let him be dead. The system of the court, built on protocol and deference to the monarch's will, adapted seamlessly. What might have been seen as madness in any other woman was simply accepted as the Queen's way. The language used by courtiers and family was always careful, always couched in the terms of sympathy and respect. They were upholding tradition. They were respecting her deep devotion. But in reality, they were enabling a fantasy becoming actors in a private play, where the main character had been gone for years. The human cost was the emotional suffocation of her own children, who were expected to participate in this perpetual performance of sorrow. Her son, the heir to the throne, was treated as a disappointment, a frivolous reminder of a world that had moved on a world his mother refused to rejoin. Then into this hermetically sealed world of grief and ritual came an anomaly, a man who refused to play the game. John Brown, a Scottish gillie from the Balmoral estate, was brought south to serve the Queen. He was coarse, direct, and utterly unimpressed by royal protocol. He spoke to Victoria not as a monarch, but as a woman. He ordered her to get out of the carriage to take walks to engage with the world. And she, the most powerful woman on the planet, obeyed. Their relationship became the most whispered about scandal of the age. Was he her lover? Her medium channeling Albert's spirit? Had they secretly married? We will likely never know. But his presence reveals a crucial truth. Victoria's grief, the grief she had weaponized to control her court and her family, was not as simple as it appeared. In John Brown, she found a connection that was fiercely alive, a blunt reality that cut through the suffocating fog of her self-imposed mourning. He was her confidant, her protector, and in many ways, her master. He was a complication that the official narrative of the devoted widow could not explain. He was a human crack in the marble facade of her sorrow. Her reliance on him showed that her heart had not stopped in 1861. It had simply gone into hiding, accessible only to a chosen few who were willing to ignore the rules she imposed on everyone else. The devotion to Albert was real, but the system she built around it was a fortress, and John Brown was the only one she ever gave a key to. As the years turned into decades, the Queen re-emerged in public, but she was a different figure. No longer just a widow. She was the grandmother of Europe, an empress, an icon of stability and imperial power. It seemed perhaps that the long winter of her grief had finally begun to thaw, but the project was not over. It had simply entered its final, most secret phase. For years, she had been working on a document. It was written in her own hand on her distinctive black-bordered stationery. It was a set of instructions, 12 pages long, to be read and obeyed only after her death. It was kept locked away, its existence known to only one or two trusted individuals. This was not a will, which is a public document dealing with property and succession. This was something else entirely. It was a script, a detailed minute-by-minute, object-by-object guide to her own entombment. This final act reveals the true nature of her 40-year project. The endless mourning, the bizarre rituals, the secret dependencies, they were all part of a larger strategy of control. She who could not control death, who could not keep her husband alive, would exert an absolute and unbreakable control over her own departure from the world. She would dictate the terms of her legacy, not in the grand histories written by men, but in the silent, secret chamber of her own coffin. The document was a final command from beyond the grave, an assertion of will so powerful it would force her successor, the King of England, to stand aside and allow a private, almost pagan ceremony to unfold. The grief had become a plan. The sorrow had become a strategy. The memory of the dead had become a blueprint for controlling the living. You didn't notice the temperature rising because the labels stayed polite. A devotion, hari, memory, duty. The story of the coffin begins as it must, with a bed. Specifically the deathbed of Prince Albert on the night of December 14, 1861, at Windsor Castle. For Queen Victoria, this was not merely a death, it was an amputation of the soul, an event so cataclysmic it fractured time itself, splitting her life into a sunlit before and a permanent twilight after. The official cause was typhoid fever, a mundane and democratic illness that paid no heed to royal blood. But in the private, frantic narrative forming in the Queen's mind, the culprit was far more specific. It was her son Bertie, the future King Edward VII. Weeks earlier, Bertie, then a student at Cambridge, had been involved in a boyish indiscretion with an actress. The news reached the palace, and Albert, ever the stern moralistic father, traveled through the cold and rain to confront his heir. He returned to Windsor, exhausted, soaked, and sick. In Victoria's grief-stricken logic, the chain of causation was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. Bertie's sin led to Albert's worry, which led to the journey, which led to the illness, which led to this unbearable, silent emptiness. Her husband had not simply died. He had been killed by the carelessness of his own son. It was a cruel, unjust verdict, but it became the foundation upon which the next 40 years of her life would be built. In the immediate aftermath, the world held its breath, waiting to see how the 42-year-old monarch would respond. The path of duty was clear, a period of intense but finite mourning, followed by a stoic return to the business of running an empire. She was, after all, queen. A sensible person, even a monarch shattered by loss, might seek solace and eventually a way forward. Victoria did not. She chose instead to build a cathedral of sorrow and live inside it for the rest of her life. This was her first and most fateful decision. She would not move on. She would not heal. She would instead perform the role of the Great Widow, a part she would play with such conviction that it would come to define not just her, but the entire era that bore her name. She had lost her future. Now her life's work would be to perfectly embalm the past. But preserving a memory and imprisoning a ghost are two very different things. The years that followed were a study in the color black. Victoria vanished from public view, a self-imposed exile that created a constitutional crisis. Prime ministers and cabinet members found themselves governing without a visible sovereign. The newspapers, at first sympathetic, grew restless. The public who had mourned with her began to wonder if their queen had abandoned them. In the silent corridors of Buckingham Palace, Osborne House, and Windsor, the rituals began. The rooms of the prince consort were frozen in time, transformed into shrines where his presence was meticulously maintained. The fiction that he had merely stepped out for a moment was upheld with a terrifying discipline. This was the environment suffocating in its reverence and stillness, into which a blast of cold Highland air was about to blow. His name was John Brown. He was a gillie from her beloved Balmoral estate in Scotland, a servant with hands calloused from work and a gaze that held no trace of the fawning deference she had known her entire life. He was brought south to help manage the Queen's horses and outdoor excursions, a practical decision that would have profound and scandalous consequences. Brown treated the Queen not as a fragile icon of grief, but as a woman. He was blunt often to the point of rudeness. He called her woman, cajoled her into taking exercise when she wished to wallow, and spoke to her with a familiarity that made the court's blood run cold. And Victoria, the Empress of a quarter of the globe, adored it. He was an antidote to the cloying sympathy and rigid protocol that surrounded her. He was real. Her dependence on him grew with astonishing speed. He became more than a servant. He was her gatekeeper, her confidant, her protector. He controlled access to the monarch, bypassing ministers and even her own children. He was, in the words of one frustrated courtier, the Queen's stallion, a coarse reference to both his former duties and his perceived status. The relationship became the great unspoken scandal of the Victorian age. The Queen, this paragon of widowly devotion to Albert, was now inseparable from her Scottish servant. They took long, unchaperoned trips together. He was given his own cottage, his own staff. His photograph appeared in private royal albums. Whispers turned into pamphlets, which gave him the notorious nickname, Mrs. Brown. Had they married in secret? Was this rough, hard-drinking Highlander the true power behind the throne? The truth was likely more complex, a deep emotional intimacy that defied conventional labels. But the perception was toxic. The downfall was not of her crown, but of her carefully constructed image. The great widow, perpetually mourning the perfect prince, was now seen by many as a hypocrite in thrall to a commoner. Her own children were horrified and jealous, forced to watch this servant command the affection and attention their mother denied them. For Victoria, this only deepened her resolve. The world did not understand. Her family did not understand. Therefore, her private life, her true emotional reality, had to be protected, shielded, and controlled with even greater ferocity. Her public life was the performance of eternal mourning for Albert. Her private life was a fiercely guarded fortress built around the companionship of John Brown. These two narratives, one for the world and one for herself, could not coexist openly. They could only be reconciled in a place of absolute secrecy. She had built a new world around this rugged, constant figure. But mortality, the great betrayer, was about to strike again, and this time, the loss would not create a public spectacle, but a far more dangerous private resolve. In 1883, John Brown died. For the Queen, it was a second widowhood, a loss in some ways more devastating than the first, because it was a grief she could not perform publicly. She could not build national monuments to a gillie. She could only mourn in private, commissioning a statue of him for the Balmoral grounds and writing a grief-stricken, adoring biography that her advisors had to desperately persuade her not to publish. The loss of her two great loves, Albert the Prince and Brown the Commoner, cemented the final project of her life, the meticulous curation of her own death. Her final 2 decades were a paradox. In public, she was at the zenith of her power. The Golden and Diamond Jubilees of 1887 and 1897 were spectacular displays of imperial might, with the small black-clad queen at the center of a global celebration. She was the Empress of India, the grandmother of Europe, a living symbol of British dominion. But in the quiet hours at Osborne or Windsor, she was an old woman contemplating the end, and she was leaving nothing to chance. It was during this period that the 12-page memorandum took its final shape. This was not the work of a sentimental old woman. It was the work of a master strategist, the final campaign of a monarch who had spent a lifetime managing her own image. The document was her ultimate weapon against the judgment of history, against the interpretations of her children, against the gossip of the court. It was a preemptive strike, an act of posthumous stage management on an unprecedented scale. The level of detail was breathtaking. It specified the type of wood for the coffin from her own estate, the military regalia that must be absent, the type of lace, the flowers, and most importantly, the precise placement of a collection of objects that together told the secret story of her heart. The document was a map to her soul, and she entrusted it to only one person, her personal physician, Sir James Reid, with strict instructions that it was for his eyes only to be acted upon at the moment of her death without consultation or question. On January 22, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the final act began. Surrounded by her children and grandchildren, including the future King of England and the German Kaiser, Queen Victoria died. Her 63-year reign, the longest in British history, was over. The Victorian age had come to a close. As the family began the formal process of mourning and succession, Dr. Reid quietly retrieved a sealed envelope. The Queen was dead. The new King Edward VII was in charge, but the dead hand of the old monarch still held power. Inside that envelope was her final command, and with it a set of instructions so strange, so personal, and so utterly defiant of her public image that it would prove the last 40 years had not been a mourning period, but a rehearsal for one final shocking performance. The doors of the Frogmore Mausoleum swing shut, leaving the new king and his court outside in the cold January air. Inside, the world shrinks to the space around a single open coffin. The air is thick with the scent of sawdust and lilies. Doctor James Reid unfolds a 12-page document written in the late Queen's spidery, determined hand. He and the Queen's dresser, Mrs. Tuck, are the sole guardians of this final secret ceremony. They are not here to mourn. They are here to follow orders. The time for what the world thinks is over. The time for what Victoria knew has begun. Let's begin the autopsy. The official story, the one recited in newspapers from London to Calcutta, is simple, elegant, and deeply moving. A grieving widow, after 40 years of inconsolable sorrow, is finally laid to rest with sentimental tokens of her one great love, Prince Albert. It's a narrative of perfect fidelity, a story so pure it feels less like history and more like a myth. It is a beautiful story, it is also a carefully constructed lie of omission. The objects placed in this coffin were not just mementos, they were evidence. And the story they tell is of a heart far more complex and a will far more controlling than the official narrative would ever allow. Let's examine the exhibits. According to the Queen's explicit instructions, the first layer of this elaborate final tableau was dedicated to the man who had defined her life. On her right side, her better side, Dr. Reid was to place a small plaster cast of Prince Albert's hand. This was a relic she had commissioned shortly after his death in 1861, a perfect cold white replica of the hand that had guided her, a hand she could no longer hold. Atop her body, before the coffin was sealed, was to be laid one of his dressing gowns. On the surface, this evidence seems to perfectly support the official story. These are the actions of a devoted wife seeking a final tangible connection to her departed husband. But a forensic historian learns to look past the obvious. We are not dealing with simple sentiment here. We are dealing with a profound, almost pathological need to defy the separation of death. Consider the nature of the objects. She did not ask for a portrait, a representation of his likeness. She asks for a three-dimensional cast of his physical form, an object designed to be held to fit within her own hand. This wasn't about remembering what he looked like. It was about recreating the physical sensation of his presence. It speaks to a grief so deep, it required a physical anchor, a cold plaster substitute for the warmth of a living touch. The dressing gown is even more intimate. It's not a formal uniform or a piece of royal regalia. It is a domestic garment, an item that would have carried his scent, an object it imbued with the mundane reality of their shared life. Placing it over her body was an attempt to be wrapped in his presence one last time, a sensory baptism into her own memory of him. This goes beyond simple mementos. This is the toolkit of someone trying to build a bridge across the abyss of mortality, using the raw materials of sensory memory. Exhibit A, therefore, doesn't just tell us she loved him. It tells us that for 40 years, she had been unable to translate that love from a living, breathing reality into a memory. The grief was not a scar. It was a perpetually open wound, and these objects were the dressings she intended to carry with her into eternity. It's a touching display, but it is also the first indication that we are in the presence of an obsession so powerful it sought to bend the rules of the afterlife itself. Now we turn the body over, metaphorically speaking, and examine what was placed in her left hand. And it is here that the official narrative shatters into a million pieces. For this is where Dr. Reid, following his secret instructions, was to place the items that spoke of the other great and far more controversial love of Queen Victoria's life. Tucked into her left hand, a place of intimacy and personal significance, was a photograph of John Brown, with it a lock of his coarse Highland hair. And on the third finger of that same hand, beneath the floral bouquets that would later conceal it from view, the doctor was instructed to place a ring. Not just any ring. It was the wedding ring that had belonged to John Brown's mother. Let this sink in. The Queen of England, the defender of the faith, the symbol of Victorian propriety, went to her grave wearing the wedding ring of her servant's mother, clutching his picture and a lock of his hair. This is the piece of evidence that detonates the entire myth of the Great Widow. This was a secret she was unwilling to relinquish even in death. The placement is everything. The Albert memorabilia was for her right side, the public side, the side of duty and formal connection. But the Brown memorabilia was for the left, the side of the heart, hidden, protected, intensely personal. This exhibit forces us to re-examine the last 40 years of her reign. Was her perpetual mourning for Albert also a convenient public shield, a performance so convincing it allowed her to conduct a deep, private, and emotionally vital relationship away from the prying eyes of the world? John Brown was her reality when Albert had become a marble saint. He was the man who made her laugh, who challenged her, who brought her back to life when she had dedicated herself to being a living monument. The love for Albert was undoubtedly real, a foundational truth of her existence. But the evidence in her left hand suggests that it was not the only truth. She had lived a double life, in a sense, the public widow and the private companion. And in her final act, she refused to choose between them. She would have them both. She would lie in her coffin, a fulcrum between the two defining men of her life, holding the symbols of her respectable public love and her scandalous private one. The ring is the most potent symbol of all. A wedding ring, even one belonging to a mother, is a statement of union. To have it placed on her finger in the secrecy of her coffin was her final silent and irrefutable acknowledgement of the bond she shared with Brown. It was an act of defiance against her children, who had despised him, against her court, who had whispered about him, and against a history that she knew would try to erase him. She made him family in the most permanent way she could devise. Exhibit B is not just a twist, it's a confession. The final layer of this ritual completes the picture, and it is here we see Victoria, the master strategist, the ultimate producer of her own final show. After all the objects were in place, her face was to be covered with her own wedding veil, the one she had worn when she married Albert in 1840. The symbolism is as powerful as it is deliberate. She was not being buried as a queen, an empress, or even a widow. She was being buried as a bride. This single act is a masterpiece of psychological stagecraft. It rewrites the entire narrative of her life. The 61 years that had passed since her wedding day, the 40 years of grim black-clad widowhood, the messy complication of John Brown, all of it was being symbolically erased. In death, she was reverting to that perfect, joyful moment of union. She was not an old woman ending a long and complex life. She was a young bride beginning a new, eternal one with her beloved. It was an act of time travel, a refusal to be defined by the long, lonely years of her reign. She was closing the book of her life by turning back to the first page. Around her, a curated collection of other items was arranged, each a carefully chosen symbol: a sprig of Balmoral heather, a plant that connected her to both Albert's and Brown's beloved Scotland, an array of family jewelry, bracelets, necklaces, rings from her children and grandchildren, placed around her like a suit of armor built from filial loyalty. This was a message to those she was leaving behind. You may have resented my choices, you may not have understood my grief, but in the end you will surround me, you will protect me. It was a final assertion of her role as the matriarch, binding her descendants to her even in death. Exhibit C reveals the ultimate goal. This was not a burial, it was a coronation into the afterlife, with every object serving as a piece of her new, eternal regalia, each one telling a specific part of the story she wanted told. So what is the real mechanism at play here? It is not the supernatural. It is the intersection of two of the most powerful forces in human experience: absolute power and unprocessed grief. For 40 years, Victoria was a prisoner of her own sorrow, but she was a prisoner who held all the keys. Any other person would have been forced by life's necessities to move on, but a queen has no such necessities. She had the power to bend reality to her will, and she did, creating a court that orbited her grief like a planet around a dead star. The coffin was the final logical extension of this power. It was the one single space in the entire British Empire that was hers and hers alone. It was a private territory where her will was absolute, beyond the reach of Parliament, her family, or public opinion. The true mechanism was her discovery that if you have enough power, you can treat eternity itself as a final act of administration. This was not about faith or the afterlife in a religious sense. It was about control, logistics, and legacy management. She was in essence her own archivist and curator, and her body was the final exhibition. The curse that haunted Queen Victoria was not Albert's ghost. It was the crushing 40-year weight of a grief she refused to process, amplified by the absolute power of a monarch to enforce her private obsessions on her own legacy. The cursed chamber was not a room in Windsor Castle filled with spectral whispers. It was a space 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, lined with satin meticulously packed with the contradictory evidence of a secret life. It was a time capsule of a human heart sealed away from the judgment of her family, her empire, and of history itself. In her final silent act, Queen Victoria did not simply die, she curated, and she left us to excavate the truth. So what is the final verdict on the contents of Queen Victoria's coffin? What most likely happened in that sealed, silent chamber? Victoria was not mad. She was not a sentimentalist, lost in a fog of grief. She was one of the most brilliant and ruthless image makers of the modern age, and her coffin was her final, most personal and most audacious piece of propaganda. For 40 years, she had performed the role of Albert's perfect widow for the world, but in her last act, she refused to let that public performance be the final word. The careful hierarchical placement of the mementos was a deliberate and calculated statement. Albert's relics were positioned on her right, the side of public presentation and formal power, acknowledging his role as her prince consort. But Brown's far more intimate tokens were clutched in her left hand, hidden from view, shielded by flowers held close to the heart. This was not the act of a confused mind. It was the act of a master curator creating a final secret exhibition of her life as she had lived it. She was acknowledging the two great loves of her life, one a public pillar of the empire, the other a private anchor of her soul, and giving each their proper eternal due. It was the ultimate act of a woman who, after a lifetime defined by public duty, reclaimed her private narrative in the most permanent way imaginable. The immediate ripple effect was felt most acutely by her son. The moment King Edward VII was free from his mother's suffocating control, he launched a rebellion of light and air. He famously toured the royal residences shouting, "Open the windows, let in some air." He had paintings, moved rooms redecorated, and decades of dusty, stagnant grief fumigated from the palaces. The Edwardian era was born as a direct, almost violent reaction against the Victorian one, where his mother's court was black, his was gold, where hers was silent, his was filled with laughter, champagne, and the rustle of silk. The contents of the coffin remained a secret, but the oppressive atmosphere they represented was exercised with theatrical gusto. On a larger cultural scale, Victoria's 40-year performance, culminating in this secret death ritual, cemented the very idea of Victorianism in the public imagination. The obsession with elaborate mourning, the romanticization of death, the rigid public morality, all of it was epitomized by the Queen herself. She did not just reflect her era, she actively shaped it, and her final wishes were the capstone on the monument of solemnity she had built. And yet, her final act of secrecy did not kill the rumors, it immortalized them. The whispers about her and John Brown never truly went away. By taking his tokens to her grave, she ensured the mystery would live forever. The coffin, a locked chamber, became the ultimate source of speculation, guaranteeing that history could never tell a simple story about her. She had planted a permanent question mark at the very heart of her legacy. History is a logbook of plausible mistakes made with perfect confidence. But sometimes it is also a record of secret truths hidden with that same perfect confidence. For 63 years, Queen Victoria ruled an empire that stretched across the globe. But for the last 40, grief and memory ruled her. In her final moments, she chose not to be the empress, the defender of the faith, or even the mother of her people. She chose to be a woman with a woman's complex heart and contradictory loves, and her coffin was its final silent throne. What's your verdict? Was this a final act of love or the ultimate act of control? And what do you believe that ring from John Brown's mother truly signified? Let me know your theories in the comments below. The most compelling stories in history are rarely the official ones. They are the ones whispered in secret and sealed in darkness. Subscribe to Cursed Chambers to unlock more of them.